Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one where we dive into tons of interesting topics and people, and another where we just dive into tons of family-friendly books and stories. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, let's learn all about Thomas Jefferson. Yes, piggybacking on our episode all about George Washington, this will be one of a series of podcast episodes on our founding fathers. Here, this episode going out in the summer of 2026, the 250th anniversary of our country. And how can we not have an episode of this towering figure? He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was our third president. He founded the University of Virginia. He was a scholar. He was a politician, thinker, and a visionary. But he wasn't without his faults, and he had many, like all of us. So, let's learn all about the life of Thomas Jefferson. And before we get started, consider supporting our podcast, helping out with our expenses. Please go to patreon.com if you're so inclined, and there's options there to help us out. Please look for the link in the show notes. So, Thomas Jefferson. He was born on April 13, 1743 at Shadwell. This was his family's plantation in the Virginia countryside and was just a few miles from what would eventually become known as Charlottesville. Everything about his life is still there. The University of Virginia and Monticello, his home, which we will get into. And one thing you got to know up front, he did not start his life poor and work his way up. He was born into wealth. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a successful planter, landowner, mapmaker, surveyor, and his mother was even more well-to-do. Her name was Jane Randolph Jefferson, and she came from the Randolph family, one of the wealthiest and most prominent families in Virginia. Thomas was the third of 10 children, although 2 died very young, which was the case so much, unfortunately, back then. He grew up surrounded by lands, books, horses, farming, and yes, enslaved labor. When his father passed away in 1757, Thomas was only 14, and he eventually inherited almost 2,800 acres of land, again with enslaved people. So Jefferson would certainly accomplish unbelievable things in his life, but it wasn't like he had to climb the financial ladder. He had all these benefits right from the beginning. And he was well educated. Again, I'm going to reference his similarities and differences with George Washington. Hey, they're the first two on Mount Rushmore. Washington represented the birth and foundation of the nation, and Jefferson, he represented the growth and the expansion of the country with the Louisiana Purchase, the first president, the third president. But getting back to my point, Washington wasn't educated like Jefferson was. Jefferson studied Latin, Greek, French, math, history, classic literature. In 1760, when he's 17 years old, he entered the College of William and Mary, still there today in Williamsburg, Virginia. And at the time, Williamsburg was the capital of Virginia. And for a young man, right, from the countryside, it placed Jefferson right smack in the middle of Virginia's political world, Virginia's intellectual world. And one of his early influences, one of his earliest mentors was George Wythe, who was really one of the first early legal scholars in our country. And he was admitted to this law practice under Wythe in 1767. And here's the thing you got to know about Jefferson. He, like I said early on, was educated and he was brilliant. He loved to write. He was a great writer, but he hated public speaking and he wasn't good at it. And unlike Washington, he never became a soldier. But what he did, still in his 20s, 1769, he entered Virginia's legislature. It was called the House of Burgesses. And right around the same time, yes, he decided to build a house on top of a mountain. just like Mount Vernon. This was Jefferson's Mount Vernon. It's called Monticello. It was property that he inherited near Shadewell. He played there as a boy, and he began clearing the mountaintop. He called it Monticello because it was an Italian word that meant roughly little mountain. He wasn't simply hiring an architect and choosing a house from somebody else's plans. Architecture fascinated him. Just like Washington, he built this house himself. Construction began around 1769, and he would continue his whole life redesigning, rebuilding, expanding it, and tinkering with it for decades. It was no doubt his passion project. Then, after this, he got married. January 1st, 1772. He married Martha Wayes Skelton. She was 23 years old and wealthy. She brought lots of property into the marriage on top of everything he already owned. And when her father, John Wales, died the following year, the Jefferson family acquired additional land and, yes, enslaved people. You cannot discount this. All the slaves he had during his entire life. Thomas and Martha had 6 children together, but childhood mortality, like I mentioned, was horrible. Only 2 daughters survived until adulthood. Martha, again, they called her Patsy, just like Washington's stepchild, and Mary, they often called her Maria or Polly. She survived to adulthood. Martha herself became seriously ill after years of pregnancies, and she passed away in 1782 at only 33 years old. Jefferson was only 39, and of course he was devastated, and he never remarried. Now again, during this whole time, he became famous because the relationship between Britain and the American colonies were falling apart, again paralleling Washington's rise to power. Well, he became known in Virginia as a gifted writer. I've mentioned this many times, but it's because he put the pen to the paper. In 1774, he wrote a summary view of the rights of British America. It was an argument that the colonists possessed rights that the British government was violating. The documents circulated throughout Virginia and really throughout all the different colonies. This is how he made a name for himself, and yes, it led to a 33-year-old writing one of the most important pieces of paper you could argue in the history of mankind. And here is how it happened. He just didn't appear in Philly out of nowhere, as I mentioned. Virginia ended up sending him to the Second Continental Congress in 1775. By then, he was already had his reputation intact, not only as a great political thinker, but as a great writer. He was young compared to Benjamin Franklin, some of the other delegates, right? But in June of 1776, Congress appointed 5 men to prepare a declaration explaining why the colonies were separating from Britain. The committee included Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. And Jefferson was asked to prepare the first draft. Adams later explained that Jefferson had several advantages, right? There were multiple people that wanted other people to write it. He was young, he was inexperienced, but as Adams said, he was from Virginia, which was huge because the colonies are up and down the East Coast, and you wanted someone whose prose obviously made the point. You needed to be a great writer. And a lot of the ideas didn't originate with Jefferson. They drew upon Enlightenment philosophy, British political traditions, colonial arguments about rights and ideas that have been developed for years. And Congress did edit the draft. But pretty much everything was Jefferson's, including that famous line that all men are created equal and possess rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But that famous line, we hold these truths to be self-evident, the first part of the sentence was Jefferson's. The second part, originally, Jefferson had written sacred and undeniable. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. Franklin got rid of that. He was a man of science, like I said, the Enlightenment, rational person, and he wanted the text to sound that way rather than being overly religious. It was an important distinction and really a famous distinction because, again, think about it. Jefferson's version implied that these truths are holy and revealed through God or revealed through religion, which again was a prevalent thought during that time, and it was nothing really wrong with it. But Franklin insisted that no, these truths need to be rather obvious to anyone that was using human reason, like mathematical or scientific thinking, like the idea that, yeah, 2 + 1 does equal 3, and this is evident. And Franklin also changed a couple other spots where Jefferson referred to colonies, and he wanted to change that to states, which he did. And there was another dramatic phrase that Jefferson had written, deluge us in blood, referring to Britain. And Franklin said, no, just streamline it, and he replaced it with destroy us instead. So no question, like any writer, hey, you're going to edit, you're going to change. And Jefferson had a pretty good mentor right beside him in Benjamin Franklin. But before we leave the text of the Declaration of Independence, we have to address the elephant in the room. Despite how learned he was, despite how he said all men are created equal, clearly this wasn't the case. The early draft that he put together condemned the transatlantic slave trade, and he wrote, quote, the cruel war against human nature itself, but he fell victim to political compromise, the reality of the South wanting to appease those delegates from Georgia and South Carolina. So no question he struggled under the weight of this particular issue. And this is not even bringing up the fact that what about women? He never addressed that at all during that time and even in the future. So here is really, I think, to put this in context, to Jefferson, the idea about him writing all men are created equal, it was originally meant, and you could argue, that the American colonists had the same right to rule themselves as the British government. I think that was the context of what he was saying. It was his way of saying, yeah, a king isn't born better than us, and he has no real given right to rule over us. So this is a long-winded way of saying, as much as this document is brilliant, so well written, and set the foundation for our country, certainly it wasn't without its faults. And this led into his personal life as well. As I've mentioned plenty of times before, he inherited enslaved people and he kept slaves throughout his life. The numbers are about 600, and in his lifetime, and then even through his will, he only freed 7 of them. And here's the thing, again, to wrap up this point, that he may have written powerfully about liberty and equality, but as with a lot of people during this time, he didn't always live those ideals in his own life. So Jefferson is still young. His political career, his fame certainly didn't end with writing the Declaration of Independence. It was only beginning. After he left Congress, he returned to Virginia and he started work on rewriting the state's laws. And one of the accomplishments he was proud of was his work establishing religious freedom. Jefferson believed that government shouldn't dictate a person's religious belief, which is so ingrained in our beginning of our country and our Constitution, certainly with the beginnings of Pennsylvania and William Penn, so important. Right? So from 1779 to 1781, he was the governor of Virginia, right in the middle of the Revolutionary War. You're often thinking, where was his story during that entire war? Well, again, he had an important job. That was not the strongest chapter of his career, however. British forces invaded Virginia. The state government was forced to flee, and Jefferson was actually really criticized for his leadership during this entire crisis. He simply wasn't a military leader. His strengths were obviously elsewhere. And it was really the following year in 1782 when his wife passed away, when his life changed dramatically. Again, this is important to know. So many of us forget this. In 1784, again, this is after the Treaty of Paris, Congress sent him to Europe. And in 1785, he succeeded Benjamin Franklin as the American minister to France. He lived in France for several years. He surrounded him with everything about European culture, art, architecture, food, you name it. And so much of this experience really informed his decisions later on in his political career. So he returns to America in 1789, just as the new federal government under the Constitution was getting started. George Washington was now our president, and he chose Jefferson at this point to be the nation's first Secretary of State in 1790. This is all for my younger members of the audience. You're talking about Secretary of State. You're talking about the person that's in charge of our new relationships with the rest of the world. And it was this job in Washington's first cabinet that he came to be defined by his philosophy going forward in exactly the opposite view of his colleague and, yes, a rival, Alexander Hamilton. Why? Because Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury, and both men viewed the government, the first government, in dramatically different ways, and it shaped the beginnings of political parties and opposite views of how government should be run for the people. The simplest terms and the way I could say this is Hamilton favored a strong federal government, and it was just the opposite in terms of Jefferson's views. He wanted more power with the states, and you can see this still playing out today. So right away in Washington's first term, he found himself in the middle between Hamilton and Jefferson. So Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State at the end of 1793 and returned to Monticello, but he definitely wasn't done with politics. In the election of 1796, he ran against John Adams. This was really interesting because, again, they had once been close partners. They had served together in the Continental Congress. They helped write the Declaration of Independence, and yet their friendship was really damaged with politics, no doubt. But listen to this. With the rules at the time, Adams was now our second president. But the person who had come in second in the election would be vice president. So here they are in opposite political points of view, and they are working together in the White House. And then 4 years later, they ran against each other in the election of 1800, and Jefferson wins. It was really combative, and their friendship 100% disappeared. And we will get to this later, but as a sign of so much of what's wonderful about our country, their friendship was rekindled later in life, and isn't that remarkable? So here is Jefferson, now our third president of the United States. He's a supporter of state rights, and you know what? When you're the leader of a brand new country, it's easier to just spout philosophies than actually the reality of being the president. And one of the perfect examples was what came up right away in 1803. He did something that no doubt cemented his legacy in terms of adding to our country and something being so important. He bought the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon Bonaparte. French had been looking for money. They had been busy fighting a war over in Europe. And here he was. Think of it. Jefferson originally, he just wanted to secure New Orleans, and he wanted access to the Mississippi River. Instead, Napoleon basically said, you can have everything. And the price was $15 million. He had spent years arguing that the federal government only possessed powers granted to it by the Constitution, and nowhere in the Constitution did it say that a president could purchase foreign territory. So he considered seeking a constitutional amendment, but he also realized the opportunity would disappear. So with executive power, in the first real example of this, he acted. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the size of the United States. He then supported the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore all this new Western territory, and absolutely, people are still arguing today, hey, yes, he had this philosophy about small government having more power with the states, but when conditions are ripe and it's important for the national interest, he would move and support this idea of, yes, the national government being important. So here he is now. He left after 2 terms in the presidency, and it's now 1809. He went home. For the last 17 years of his life, Monticello became the center of his world, just like George Washington, with Mount Vernon being the center of his world. He redesigned it. He added the famous dome that certainly makes it so recognizable today, not only with his own home, but the monument that is still there in Washington, D.C. today, along with the Washington Monument, and certainly later on with the Lincoln Memorial. But here was a big problem. All during this time, he was deeply in debt. Despite being born wealthy, inheriting land, acquiring additional property through marriage, right? He was a poor financial manager. His expensive lifestyle, construction projects, agricultural problems, inherited debts, you name it. So unlike Washington. Yet, during this time period, he took on one big final project. He wanted to build a university. He had believed for decades that the republic, this new country, government, could survive only if the citizen, particularly its future leaders, were educated. He wanted Virginia to have the greatest public university that wasn't controlled by a particular church or private interest. So in 1819, the Commonwealth of Virginia chartered the University of Virginia near Charlottesville. Jefferson didn't merely suggest the idea. He helped choose the site. He planned the curriculum. He recruited professors. He selected the books. And yes, being Jefferson, he helped design the campus himself. Everything about this university still there today is and was inspired by him and really built by him. So the university opened in 1825, and here it was that Jefferson was 81 years old, but he still had one chapter left in his remarkable life, and that was reconciling with John Adams. Yes, after that bitter election in 1800, they went years without talking to each other or communicating. But in 1812, with encouragement from their mutual friend Benjamin Rush, the 2 former presidents began writing to each other again. The correspondence became really one of the greatest friendships by letters in American history. It's all there for you to read still today. And on a personal note, I can clearly understand this. You get later on into your life and the careers, the ascension to power, the things that were so important in developing who you were. At the end of the day, you're just 2 men. And they obviously, like I said, reconciled the bitterness and came to recognize that they were so, in many ways, alike, the same. They were instrumental in building this brand new country, and how could you not have a good relationship, especially in your later years? So here it is, 1826, and Jefferson is 83. That summer, the Americans were preparing to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was invited to attend celebrations in Washington, but was too weak to travel. At Monticello, his health deteriorated. Jefferson passed away on July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence and hundreds of miles away in Massachusetts, 90-year-old John Adams was also dying. And apparently one of his final words was, "So, Thomas Jefferson survives." But Adams didn't know that Jefferson had died several hours earlier when he said that. Adams died the very same day later on, July 4th, 1826. So listen to this. He was buried in Monticello, and one of the most revealing things about him, on his tombstone, he did not ask to be remembered as the governor of Virginia. He didn't mention being Secretary of State. He didn't mention being vice president. He didn't even mention that he had been president of the United States. On his tombstone, he wanted to be remembered for only three things, and this is what's written on there: the author of the Declaration of American Independence, the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia. This was Thomas Jefferson. So to wrap up the podcast, just like we did with George Washington, here's some other tidbits, some interesting facts about this incredible man. Like Washington, he was tall. He was 6'2.5". I mentioned he was a terrible public speaker, but think of this. He had to address Congress a lot. So very often he just didn't. He submitted his messages to Congress in writing rather than delivering them personally and speaking. He was a great violin player. He owned thousands of books. Even after Washington was burned by the Brits during the War of 1812, the Congressional Library was destroyed. He sold Congress his personal collection of almost 6,500 books. He was obsessed with measuring things, whether it was the weather, temperature, rainfall. He kept all these records throughout his life. He had the curiosity of a scientist, and he was an inventor. He invented this little portable desk that he wrote the Declaration of Independence on. He invented the swivel chair. And believe it or not, he invented this macaroni machine that was basically this wooden press that forced the dough through this metal plates. And yeah, they had strands of macaroni that would come out on the other side. He even had his bed that was built into a wall that basically connected two rooms. He could essentially get out of bed on one side in his bedroom, and then all of a sudden he's in the other side in his study. He loved ice cream. He didn't really invent it, but he definitely popularized it in America. And he left behind this handwritten vanilla ice cream recipe. And absolutely, it was one of the earliest surviving American recipes for ice cream. And unlike Washington, that really made sure that he was dressed impeccably. Sometimes he would greet, again, a little fun fact, he would greet White House guests in his slippers. Foreign diplomats that were used to these European royal courts actually wrote about the fact that, Jefferson was very informal very often. And he was really interested in mammoths. He actually believed before he sent Lewis and Clark out to explore the West, he was intently interested and hoping that there was these huge animals out there that had never been seen before. And finally, we talked about his debt. Now, this wasn't particularly one or two isolated instances. It was a lifetime of just spending more than your income. I mean, specifically, there were a few incidences. He inherited a lot of debt from his father-in-law. He suffered a $30,000 loss when a flood destroyed his milling investment in 1810. And he made this disastrous decision to co-sign a $20,000 loan for his friend, who was Wilson Carey Nicholas. And Nicholas died, and then Jefferson became responsible for the debt. And the Panic of 1819, just to wrap this up, definitely added to the stress. And this was something, again, that Washington didn't have to deal with. And he had his income that was dramatically affected by this. And by the time he passed away, He was in debt $107,000, which was huge for that time. Now, if you're visiting Monticello today, this is all important to know. His family paid a huge price for him dying in debt. After he passed away, the estate had to sell off pretty much everything, including enslaved people. Tragically, nearly 100 men, women, and children were sold at an auction in 1827, with others sold separately to help pay all of his debts. We're talking furniture, livestock, farm equipment, not only the land, but his household possessions. His daughter, Martha, inherited Monticello, but the family couldn't afford to keep it. And in 1831, she sold the house and all 552 acres to a local pharmacist. His name was James Turner Barclay. But 3 years later, Barclay sold it to Uriah Levy. He was a U.S. naval officer, and he was a big supporter and admirer of Jefferson. And he began preserving and restoring the deteriorating house. Monticello never returned to Thomas Jefferson's descendants. It had some complicated interruptions surrounding the Civil War, and certainly it did remain in the Levy family for 90 years, and eventually it passed to Uriah's nephew, Jefferson Monroe Levy. He spent considerable money restoring it, and yes, in 1923, Levy sold Monticello for $500,000 to the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation. Today, it's called Thomas Jefferson's Foundation. It's a private nonprofit organization, and that organization still owns and operates Monticello today. So, remarkably, Jefferson's family lost his famous home only a few years after his death, and they never got it back. So, like most people, he had certainly huge successes, and he had failures. He had areas in his life that certainly he's not necessarily that proud of, but this is a towering figure, one of the founding fathers of our country, and he needs to be remembered for that. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He doubled the size of our country. He served as our third president. And yes, he was a brilliant statesman, writer, and someone certainly to be proud of, to call our own, up there at Mount Rushmore forever. Friends, thanks for taking this journey with me, learning all about the life and times of Thomas Jefferson. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. We are on X. We are on Facebook. We are on YouTube. We are on Substack. Look at all the show notes in the podcast description. And yes, always appreciate the reviews, the ratings, and now we have patreon.com where you can support the podcast financially. Look for the link that says support the show. Until next time, have fun and keep learning.